Welcome to the Capitalism Workshop. Tonight's session with Troy Vettese is on Freeze the Thames, Geo-Science, Social Risk and Climate Struggles. It's organized by the Center for Social Justice and Socialist Project. We've been organizing a series of workshops over the last couple of years on dealing with contemporary capitalism and the remaking of 21st century socialism. Over the last year and a half, we've planned a number of workshops, particularly centered on the so-called gig economy, the various forms by which capitalism is restructuring its forms of accumulation and labor processes, and the different forms of work and other struggles that have been forming around those, and also in and around various issues related to eco-socialism, and obviously particularly climate justice and climate change. Tonight's discussion, I think, is important for a whole bunch of reasons. The first thing I would like to mention is for those of us who have been engaged in struggles around eco-socialism for quite a while, have been particularly influenced by what John Bellamy Foster and Paul Burkett, two of the key thinkers around eco-socialism, have called the first generation of eco-socialist thinking, like Joel Covell, James O'Connor, and Elmar Altvater, who all passed this year, and just like to acknowledge kind of their importance to these issues. They were central into thinking these things. That first, second generation thing of that I was speaking about from John doesn't quite fit any of those people who kind of made contributions to thinking about the foundations of an eco-socialist project and the continuing importance of it for thinking today's transformation. Yes, it's very difficult to think. They were all friends of several of us in the room, and it's difficult to kind of see them all pass in this last year. In any case, it's also very good to see people like Troy and others picking up the work that they had kind of laid out. The other thing is, of course, is the disappointments and everything else to do with the most recent COP24 meetings that were held in Poland in the late fall, and the disappointments of what was called. And of course, there's right now in Canada, there's the difficult important struggle occurring around pipelines in Canada, particularly in the Wet'suwet'en First Nations area, on the area just below Prince Rupert on the west coast, which is evidence again to all the problems and contradictions that we have in this country in dealing with climate justice, which is so intertwined with First Nations issues. And the struggles of First Nations for control over those territories, and the way that the Canadian state, in defense of the oil industry and so forth, continues to intervene around First Nations issues in the most brutal way to enforce the alliance that the Canadian state at all levels and the Canadian ruling class have made in and around oil exploration, which one of the speakers today is one of our most adamant critics of, and probably will say a word or two about those things as well, Gord Laxer. This discussion today is part of what has intensified over the last couple of years around debating green strategies. Some of the urgency of climate change and the way that it seems less and less viable that will meet anything close to the parameters that were set of the rise in temperatures has led to a lot of different kinds of thinking. One of them has been a certain kind of general geo-engineering. Some of it is a left geo-engineering in around a strong technological optimism that we can kind of address most of the issues with climate change directly. Some of this was seen in the Jacobin issue, Earth, Wind, and Fire, also under the various overlaps with what I was speaking about earlier in terms of the gig economy. The left accelerationists often have a very optimistic view of how automation can address some of these issues, or the kind of resurgence of the appeal of nuclear energy on the left. There also is a certain kind of optimism of green engineering, or geoengineering in terms of the energy transition, the way that people like Robert Pollin and others have focused particularly on the transition to just energy in the narrow sense as a way to deal with climate change. A variation of that has come from trade unions and for energy democracy, which has focused on the just transition side of this. More recently, obviously, the bill that, or the proposals that came from Ocasio-Cortez, the new congresswoman from New York, before Congress on the Green New Deal that she initially proposed, that can't get forward on the legislative agenda of the Democrats, but is still gaining a lot of discussion. It, represents a much broader approach, an attempt to link climate change to a whole range of issues related to healthcare, transportation, racial and gender justice issues, class justice issues, income distribution. Has tried to widen it out, which touches then more strongly on the left approach to this. Troy Vettese has just intervened in this debate in a very interesting way in the article that he'll speak to from in the New Left Review this fall. It deals with particularly the question of geoscience and the way that there might be also natural approaches to dealing with climate change directly. And we think big about some of those process changes, which is what he'll speak to. I'm going to just read two bits from the opening, which I'm then going to turn it over, which I think raise the question directly. Is advanced industrial capitalism capable of finding solutions for the environmental devastation it causes? Or are the logics of capitalism and environmental sustainability at odds? This session of the Capitalism Workshop explores the economic and politics surrounding natural geoengineering, what some people refer to as rewilding, the rewilding of agricultural land freed up by the compulsory veganism to replicate the hemispheric cooling of the Little Ice Age. We will have three speakers today on this. Particularly, we'll begin with Troy, who will speak on his recent essay. He's an environmental historian at New York University, and his dissertation is based on the relationship between tar sands and what is dominated in Canada in different forms of market ecology. He'll be followed by Gord Laxer, who I take it you two guys became friends because of the linkage over the tar sands. So Gord was an advisor a bit, I guess, on the project.
Because we both love the tar sands.
Yes, exactly. Gord is one of the great political economists of Canada over the last several decades. He was one of the founders of the Parkland Institute. His work on understanding the Canadian ruling class was very important to many of us in developing our own various projects over the years. He turned his attention over the last maybe 15 years or so, particularly to oil issues and particularly its linkage to climate change. Gord is now retired and living up in the Muskokas and is enjoying the climate up there right now. Came back down from
the last 2 months.
Came down here in a small storm. There you go. He'll be followed by Umair Mohammed, who's a doctoral student at York University, author of Confronting Injustice, Social Activism in the Age of Individualism. He's a comrade with me in the Socialist Project and one of the few socialist engineers that we have in Canada. And it's appropriate for him to intervene on some of these discussions, as well as being a very important political scientist. I'm going to turn it over to Troy now to make his presentation. Welcome, Troy.
Thank you, Greg, for that introduction, and thank you, Tanner, for organizing this. So, just to be clear, I'm still doing my PhD. It's not done yet, partially because I've been spending so much time on this topic, which is not related to my PhD. So basically what happened was 3 years ago, I read a few things, and those books and articles really got me thinking about this problem. So I first read Half-Earth by E.O. Wilson, which I'm not sure if people have read. It's basically, which I'll get into, but it's basically about half of the Earth is necessary to be rewilded to keep to prevent extinction, basically. And I also read this article in Yale E360 by Oswald Schmitz about natural geoengineering. And then I read a book by Václav Smil about power density. So I was kind of thinking through what I think, and these books really influence, and these are really the foundations of what became the article. So, I was thinking to myself a few years ago that environmentalists all kind of say the same thing, which is that they don't like geoengineering, that they don't want the sixth extinction to occur, and that they like renewables, right? And the thing is, these are generally talked about as separate debates, but the more you think about it, if you really get into it, you see they're all closely related because they all have to deal with the problem of land scarcity. So I tried to think, we want to achieve these three goals together, and then how many ways can you actually achieve that, right? So the purpose of my talk today is that I'll just kind of sketch the argument in the New Left Review article, but I also wanted to tell you my thought process that led me to make those arguments, and I would love to hear your response to that. And also I will touch a bit on my newest article, which was about the latest IPCC report, which is in the Boston Review of Books, which actually speaks quite a bit to this problem of land scarcity. So we begin with frost fairs. So has anyone read Orlando by Virginia Woolf? Okay. So does anyone remember the scene where Orlando meets Sasha and they're skating on the Thames and all that? That is actually a frost fair. So the Thames used to freeze, which it no longer does, and it hasn't frozen since 1812, I believe, 1814. And it didn't freeze much before the 15th century, but in the 16th century to the 19th century, it did freeze, and for a while it froze about once a decade. Enough to really make it into an institution where people would just have a lot of fun on the ice, right? The question is, why did it freeze? And this is a way for us to think about the Little Ice Age. Has anyone heard of the Little Ice Age? So the Little Ice Age is a few hundred years, between 1500 to 1850 or so, when it was a bit cooler, especially in the northern hemisphere. There are a few theories about why this actually occurred, but what I find most convincing is this idea that there was enough carbon sequestration going on in the Americas and Africa as well, due to mass death in those continents. So what happens is Europeans arrive in 1492 in the Americas, and there are between 50 to 100 million people living in the Americas. Within a century or so, that population is down to about 5 million people. So through enslavement, through genocide, through epidemics, the population collapses. The Europeans, they want to find labor, so they import it from West Africa, which then depopulates West Africa. About 12 million people are sent across the Atlantic. And because of this mass depopulation, force and encroach on what had used to be villages and farms and so forth. So between 20 to 40 gigatons of carbon are sequestered, and that lowers the temperature because all this carbon is then absorbed. So by around half a degree in the northern hemisphere. So why start with this? I start with this because I wanted to think, first of all, that natural reforestation or natural geoengineering can happen at a massive scale and relatively quickly. And I want us to think big for a second, but also I want to point out as well that capitalism has always been changing the climate. It's been changing the climate since it started. But then also wanted to think, what does a democratic socialist version of this look like? So again, I talk about the three things that we don't like. This is one of them. This is geoengineering, or what I would call artificial geoengineering, to differentiate it from the natural geoengineering, which was afforestation. So this is from an experiment from 2012 between Bristol and Oxford. And of the many forms of geoengineering, this is the one where they try to shoot sulfur particles into the atmosphere to then reflect sunlight back into space. This actually didn't take place because it turns out one of the scientists was trying to patent it behind the backs of the other scientists, so they actually backstabbed each other, and then they found out and they actually canceled it for that day. But these experiments are already starting to occur, and it's just a matter of time before geoengineering will happen. Because the idea about this paper is that if these things don't happen, what will then happen? Something has to give, more or less, right? So I read one book, again around this time a few years ago, by Philip Marowski called Never Let a Serious Crisis Go to Waste. And his last chapter is like, how do neoliberals plan to deal with climate change? And he really stresses geoengineering simply because it's very cheap. It only costs a couple $2 billion a year to have a program where you shoot enough sulfur particles into the atmosphere to cool the climate. It's pretty much costs nothing, basically, out of the total world GDP. Much cheaper than renewable energy and cutting back consumption and so forth. There are many problems with geoengineering. I won't go into all of them because I don't have that much time to talk right now. But a few terrible things could happen. For example, but the climatic system is so complex they don't know exactly what's going to happen, but they could cut off the monsoon system in the Indian Ocean or the Gulf Stream, which is what warms up Europe. And one can also imagine if one country doesn't like the geoengineering of another country, they might launch their own program to, let's say, undo a drought or so forth. And then at that point, if you have two separate geoengineering projects, you have no idea what the response is going to be. You can't model that, right? And the actual proponents of geoengineering, including a Canadian, David Keith, who's from Ottawa but now is tenured at Harvard, he compares it to nuclear weapons, right? As in these, it's extremely dangerous technology, but I would say within 10 years or so, it's probably going to happen. So it's something we don't want, right? As in, if we don't actually cut down energy use and stop global warming, this is what the solution is going to be imposed on everyone else. So that's the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing is renewables. Everyone says they want renewables, right? Thing is, renewables have a very low power density. So that means that the amount of energy they produce per square meter, the amount of like watts per square meter, is relatively low. Depends on the system exactly, whether it's energy crops or whether it's wind power and so forth, but it's not going to be more than 10 watts per square meter, at most 15 watts per square meter, and can be as low as half a watt per square meter. So that can be very, very low, very inefficient. And you think about fossil fuels, the most productive fossil fuel deposits can have a power density of 10,000 watts per square meter, and often like 1,000. Even the worst is around 1,000 watts per square meter. The idea is these will take up 100 times more space than fossil fuels, probably, right? And that's what we're going on. So there are some estimates of what this will actually look like. So the current energy regime in the United States takes 0.5% of the landmass, but if you convert it to 100% renewables, it would be between 20 to 50% of the landmass, right? Yeah, it would be covered with wind turbines and solar panels and so forth. And small countries that are quite populated, say Germany or the UK, the whole country would have to be covered with renewable energy systems. So the point is, this is a hard limit, right? And it's not really going to get better. Then the third thing I wanted to talk about was, what do we do about the sixth extinction? So, as I said, E.O. Wilson is very influential about this, and he argues there's a direct relationship between land mass and extinction. So if you have an ecosystem, you cut it and you say you reduce it by 90%, half the species will go extinct, more or less. And the reverse is true. If you cut it by 50%, then 90% of the species will be preserved. So you only lose 10%. So the goal is to save half of the ecosystems that exist and lose only 10% instead of 50%. So we're on track to lose 50% by the end of the century. And so that's why you need such a huge amount of space to be protected. Around only 10% or so of the world, I forget the exact number, but around 10% of the world is now protected to some degree. And so you need to increase that by quite a lot. So I include this picture of the whooping crane, and part of my point with this is that we think of extinction mostly as an arc mentality. It's like, oh, as long as we have a couple of each species, like no big deal. We can we have the DNA, we can get them back, or whatever it is. I think people forget that animals have their own cultures as well, and their own set of memories that are quite important. So you have, for example, even in the case of the whooping cranes, and because they're raised by humans, they fall in love with their human the human scientists, right? That's why they have to dress up like this. Or if they're raised by other birds, they will then fall in love and think they are actually, let's say, instead of a whooping crane, like a sandhill crane, right? And they won't actually reproduce with other whooping cranes. They don't know where to go in terms of migration, right? So as in, we think animals are all about instinct, and we figure how much of it is learned, how much is cultural as we pass down. And my point is, when we talk about extinction, we have to also think that things can be, or animals can be already extinct even if they are still alive, as in they cannot exist anymore because that cultural knowledge has been destroyed. That's just a minor point, but the next two blitz through. So the only good news I have is, to some degree, these three separate goals, which each require huge amounts of space, to some degree can actually mutually reinforce themselves. Especially this goal of biodiversity with natural geoengineering, as in with reforestation. Because ecosystems that are more biodiverse actually absorb more carbon. So there's the example here of Yellowstone, is it Yosemite Park? Or no, I think it's Yellowstone Park, where they reintroduced wolves in '95. It's Yellowstone, okay, thank you. So Yellowstone Park, because the wolves were there, they actually would, deer no longer ate saplings and all of that near the river's edge because they were more exposed. So those trees could then grow, and then also they kept the population of deer generally lower, so more trees could grow and absorb more carbon. Similarly, in British Columbia, they have more sea otters now, and they eat sea urchins, which were eating kelp. So the kelp forests have actually rebounded by quite a bit, to the point where they actually absorb 10% of British Columbia's carbon emissions. So to some degree, these goals reinforce themselves, but they still are quite hard. So that's like the starting point, as we have these three goals. And the idea is, okay, what if we don't want to achieve them? Like, what if we don't want to have 100% renewables? Well, fossil fuels are deteriorating, and to the point that we have worse and worse deposits to actually use. So it's nice to have a Canadian audience where I don't have to explain what the tar sands are. But it's really great for Canadian art. The photography is really done well, I think, with the tar sands. It's beautiful stuff. Anyway, so has anyone gone to the Anthropocene thing at the AGO? There actually was nothing about Canada, was there? That was a bit weird. But generally, the Vettese done a lot. The point is the energy return of investment, which is how much energy you need to then extract energy. So you do by per barrel. Say if you have an oil deposit and you need 1 barrel of energy to extract, let's say 100 barrels of energy, which is what it was like at the beginning of the oil age. Now it's about 30 to 1 for the best deposits in Kuwait and so forth. But for fracking, it's about 7 to 1, and for the tar sands, it's about 3 to 1. So we're at the point where the amount of energy required to produce energy is getting ever higher, imposing many costs, let alone the environmental damage from fossil fuel extraction. So we're at the bottom of the barrel as it is, and the costs are going to get ever higher. As in, the future is going to look more like Alberta than anything else. But again, I will skip ahead just for considerations of time. But if you have any questions, please ask. Again, fracking is not very good, simply because if methane actually gets released into the atmosphere, methane is an extremely powerful greenhouse gas, around 100 times more than carbon dioxide in the short term, 30 times more in the medium term. So that means you can't leak very much before it undoes any advantage of burning methane or natural gas. And the leakage rates can be extremely high, around 9%, according to some studies in some areas. So this is no like bridge fuel or whatever people want to cast it as. It's not a good thing. And then there are a lot of people who like nuclear, a lot of lefties and environmentalists who like nuclear. So George Monbiot likes nuclear, Andreas Malm likes nuclear, James Hansen likes nuclear, and they make this choice because they know that renewables have problems, right? So the point of this paper is that you have to make a hard choice somewhere. right? There's no like, it can't be like the 90s forever. You know, the good times are over. It's going to be hard. You have to choose what hard path you're going to take. So they're choosing nuclear because they know that renewables aren't an easy fix. This is a picture of Fukushima blowing up. So George Monbiot famously wrote about Fukushima, or wrote his conversion to nuclear power after Fukushima. Because he said, you know, this is the worst case scenario and still no one died. Nuclear power is great, right? The thing is, he's ignoring actually how lucky the Japanese were. Because the prime minister, he actually ordered TEPCO to flood these reactors. And TEPCO didn't want to do that. They wanted to try to salvage the reactor, but had they waited even a day or two longer, the meltdown would have proceeded so far, would have shot out much more radiation into the atmosphere, and they estimated that had it gotten that far, they would have had to evacuate Tokyo and its environment. So 50 million people would have to move, right? As in, like, the scale of the disaster could have been much, much greater. And the odds of another Chernobyl or Fukushima are said to be around 50% between now and 2050. And if people like Hansen get their way and build another 2,000 more reactors, you can imagine the odds are going to get much worse. Again, so I'm just going to touch on this. My point is, nuclear is not a good way to go. But many people, again, are making this choice. So this is a picture of a breeder reactor, and the point of breeder reactors is that unlike normal reactors, the waste product is plutonium. So it has it's another nuclear fuel. So therefore, you have problems of scarcity are over, like this is a wonderful thing, and so forth. But again, people like James Hansen are very keen on breeder reactors. The thing is, they don't tell you that they don't work very well because the coolant, which is liquid sodium, is actually combustible with air. So they spend 9/10 of the time under repair because they catch fire constantly, which is something you don't really want for a nuclear reactor. So also, if it's only working 10% of the time, this is a pretty terrible capacity factor even compared to renewables. They cost a ton of money, they don't make much energy, but what they do make is a lot of plutonium, which is why only people who are building these things now are the Indians. They just want a bomb factory. So this is not, again, like a cure-all, as you might have heard in the Green Press. I brought this up briefly because my article was a response to Herman Daly's previous interview in the New Left Review, and my only point here was most like non-Marxist or non-radical environmentalists tend to be Malthusian. So either you're Malthusian or you're Marxist, more or less, in the environmental movement. And if you're Malthusian, you're going to have a lot of terrible politics. And his proposal of having a tradable permit for giving birth, I think is a very odious idea, and I think we should also remember that in the 60s and the 70s, the environmental movement, especially in the United States, allied itself with eugenicist positions, whether it was the sterilization of poor people of color in the United States, or actually allying themselves with anti-immigration groups. So yeah, it's a pretty dark history, and we can get into it more. If you're interested in that, I would recommend reading Robert Gottlieb's Forcing the Spring. But my point is, be skeptical of people like Daly. And again, this is the very sexy, fully automated luxury communism, which is a big thing, especially in Britain these days. What's interesting, if you read their works, is that it begins with, well, solar power is cheap, so no big deal. And then as they kind of realize that their promises of giving everyone a Ferrari or champagne and so forth requires a massive amount of energy and increase in production, they start embracing geo-engineering. And they start embracing nuclear and so forth. And they don't care about the sixth extinction. I mean, if you actually were present, or if you've seen the launch of the Jacobin magazine from last year, Peter Frez says, well, you know, if everything dies and it's just us and cockroaches, no big deal, right? I mean, so they also are aware that there's a hard choice to be made, and they make the choice of embracing odious forms of energy and not caring about animals. So the point is, what are the goals, what are the options, and then this is my take on how to actually solve this problem. So you kind of look at this more or less and you think, well, okay, if we want to actually cut energy down, how would we do it? It's transportation, on the right is electricity, and then like forestry and agriculture. So you have to kind of think about, okay, how do we actually cut things down? I'm just going to rush through this real quick, but please ask questions later. One useful way, I think, of thinking about this problem is to think, okay, we need to set some kind of limit. I think a good shorthand is the 2000 Watt Society from Zurich, and their argument is that the poorest people who use about 1,000 watts, they can double their consumption to 2,000 watts. While the richest people, Americans use around 12,000, Europeans around 6,000, they have to cut down to 2,000, right? And therefore, this is a more egalitarian on a global level, which I find very attractive because usually a lot of environmentalism, poor people stay poor, rich people stay rich, and have their hybrid cars or whatever it is. But what does 2,000 watts really look like? So it's going to be a more Spartan version of a Southern German eco-yuppie. I mean, basically, you're going to have your passive house. You're not going to have a private car. You have public transit. You're going to not eat meat. You're not going to fly very much. Probably take the train instead. But my point is, like, I'm not a deep ecologist, right? I don't think we should all go back to live in the woods. My point is, you can have a good life, but you can't have everything. And this is what it would look like, which I think is not so bad. Now, we can be a bit more Spartan than this, but not too far off. Another way to think about it is to think about what happened in Cuba in the 90s. The whole point of this thought experiment is if you take something away, then what do? You don't have that many options. So if you take petroleum away, which is what happened to Cuba when the Soviet Union collapsed and they no longer had basically subsidized petroleum, they had to get by without it. And people think Cuba is a poor country. It's a rural country and all that. But they were actually using more fossil fuels per hectare than the United States in their farming, right? Whether it's for fertilizer or for pesticides and so forth, right? Extremely industrial agriculture. And they didn't grow their own food, they were importing food, right? So they had to almost overnight kind of confront this challenge. And they did that through buying 1 million bikes from China. They did that through having urban agriculture on a massive scale. There were 26,000 urban farms in Havana alone, where Havana could provide half its foodstuff and almost all its vegetables and fruits from the city itself. It's a city of 1 million people. Because they didn't have tractors, they couldn't farm extensively. They had to farm intensively, and that left 1/3 of the agricultural acreage back to nature to be rewilded. Which is why, one reason why Cuba is pretty much the only place in the Caribbean that has a very much intact ecosystem, right? The most intact reefs, for example, but a huge amount of ecological diversity exists in Cuba, partially because of its agriculture. This is not to say that Cuba is not without problems. I'm well aware of that, but this is closer to what the answer looks like than anything else, I think. As in, like, how do you maintain high levels of education and health even during a crisis? And again, the thing is, if Cuba can do this, which is, again, a poor country, much poorer than Canada or Western Europe and so forth, if a poor country can do this without help, without planning, and under an embargo, then no one really has an excuse. So we talked about at the beginning, we need half of the world for nature reserves and all that. We said, okay, instead of 100% of the land area being used for renewables, if you're Germany or something like that, if you're only down to 2,000 watts, there's only 1/3 of the land is used for renewables. So you have half plus maybe another 1/3. And then we also have to find space for everything else. So as in, where are we going to get all this space from? If you look at how people actually use their space, half of it goes to agriculture, half of the non-mountainous acreage in the world. So that's 5 billion hectares, or 5 gigahectares. So if Canada's 1 gigahectares, is 5 Canadas, is used for agriculture worldwide. 3.5 of that is used for pasture. And of the arable land, around 1/3 of it or so is used for feed, right? So, and then if you think about it a different way, an omnivore tends to use around a hectare per person, right? Because they need a cow somewhere that they're going to be eating, and then need to feed that cow. But a vegan only needs 1/10 of a hectare. So, like all of that pasture, again, vegans don't need 3.5 billion hectares of pasture. Agriculture is the only place where you can get this much land. And again, this is not me being a cranky vegan because no one likes vegans. It's the IPCC. If you read their newest report, is all about land scarcity. And it's all about natural reforestation because they know that the alternatives are dangerous. And they know that it can only come from agriculture. So if you actually read the report, it's all about reducing meat consumption. Just in terms of some numbers, I can't remember too many off the top of my head, but the idea is some of these ecosystems can store a huge amount of carbon. Like the redwoods in California, they can store, I think it was like 3,500 tons of carbon per hectare, something like that. I need to read my article, I forget. And then other like rainforests, like temperate rainforests in British Columbia, it's like 200 to 600 tons. So again, like we have to think about preserving these natural areas is going to help us for achieving our goals and actually drawing down carbon from the atmosphere. As in the protection of these areas are essential. And the more diverse they are, again, the more carbon they're going to sequester. The thing is that in some ways, a lot of these areas can bounce back, especially tropical forests can bounce back. And in other ways, we don't have very much time. So we already, in Western North America, the size of the wildfires per year has doubled compared to 40 years ago. The Amazon rainforest, which used to, never have droughts or fires, now undergoes such droughts and fires. And if it actually shrinks in size much more, the whole thing might convert to a savanna. Same with the boreal forest, like a huge carbon sink. If it gets much drier, it might become a carbon source. So in some ways, we don't have very much time. The point of this talk is I want to think through these problems. And I think part of the beauty of kind of setting hard goals is that there aren't that many ways to achieve it. So it helps really refine how you want to think about the problem, because there are very few ways to actually achieve what you want to achieve. And part of that, I think, is to actually thinking about what does like a red-green political economy actually look like. And that has to do with my own frustration as a younger PhD student reading lots of stuff on the green left or on degrowth and so forth, where I felt like there was nothing very concrete about how they were dealing with the problem. Like, tell me, how much degrowth do we need, right? Or, what does this future society actually look like? And I think if we kind of focus on the problem of land scarcity, then we can actually think of concrete demands more thoroughly. Or we have to challenge ourselves and think, okay, if we don't want to achieve this, then are we going to have geoengineering? Are we going to let species go extinct? Right? As in, we have to make those choices somewhere. And I want basically a debate on those choices. I think too many people still think there's an easy way out of this. And either it's going to be capitalism is going to solve it on its own terms, or we have to think of something better. Thank you.
Well, I'm very pleased to be part of this event and to thank Greg and Tanner and Troy as well. I used to be in the socialist left in Toronto in the 60s and 70s, but I haven't lived in this city since 1982. I lived out in Alberta then and sort of got interested in the oil industry. Buckminster Fuller said, "You never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete." Troy's Freezing of the Thames article outlines such a model. It is a brilliant big picture sketch of how not only to stop the growth of global carbon emissions, but to pull them back toward pre-industrial levels, and to protect biodiversity, make room for renewables, and remake society in a more egalitarian, socially supportive, democratic ways. The article offers ideas big enough to capture people's imaginations and provides a roadmap of how to get there and to show us that there is hope for a better future, that that's possible. Troy's article is astonishingly good. It combines very broad historical knowledge with writing that has flair and verve. It thrilled me when I read it, and it did so in second and third readings. They used to pay me to read through countless graduate student writings. Most were dry, turgid, and very boring. Troy writes not like a graduate student, but as a very accomplished thinker, able to go toe-to-toe with the best. My training as a political economist is heavily influenced by Marx. Taught me lots about standard versions of economic and political history, with an emphasis on the Western world and a fair bit of knowledge of the global South. But my perspective was a peculiarly Marxist version of productivism and humanism. I assumed that humans were creative agents in reshaping nature to make a better, classless future. I still support the latter, but now take ecology seriously, and I'm learning that humans are part of nature rather than above it. I'm still relearning. That's why I greatly admire the way Troy Vettese places ecology at the center of his wide-ranging egalitarian eco-austerity or eco-socialist analysis. Troy deftly evaluates several climate solutions, including steady-state economics, cap and trade, carbon capture, nuclear power, the 2,000-watt society for all humans, and the hopeful vision of a lower work, greater caring future. But his main focus is to offer natural geo-engineering as an alternative to artificial geoengineering, as we have just heard. The purpose of the promoters of artificial geoengineering is to allow capitalism to continue as is, or as George H. Bush said at Rio in 1992, not to alter the American way of life, that is cars, burbs, barbecued meat, backyard swimming pools, and Walmart.
Welcome to Texas.
Natural geoengineering on a broad scale, broad enough scale, requires an enormous amount of land. So Troy reintroduces the idea of land scarcity, an issue long dormant in political economy. Huge swaths of land are necessary to rewild enough to act as a giant carbon sink to remove carbon and reverse the ratio in the atmosphere. And it could help to prevent the sixth great species die-off. Troy writes about the 2,000-watt future for everyone, but not how to get there. We must cut emissions drastically. There's been much more talk about, on the demand side, going after consumers with carbon taxes, cap and trade, than going up against the supply side, corporations that produce coal, oil, including the tar sands, the auto industry. Going up against consumers may seem to be more politically possible to center-right governments like Trudeau's and that Barack Obama's was, and perhaps some Marxists may see that as easier as well. But the Gilets jaunes, or yellow vest movement in France, shows that popular resistance will likely explode from low and middle income people who are hard pressed to make ends meet. To meet Canada's very inadequate 2030 climate target, Canada must more than quadruple the level that our carbon tax is supposed to get to in 2022, which is $50 a ton. To meet the IPCC goals, which is much harder than our Canada's Paris goals, Canada's carbon tax would have to be perhaps 40 times as high, up as high as $2,000 a ton. That's a huge problem. The very unequal income distribution prevents a very high rise in carbon taxes, high enough to do the trick. You can't raise gasoline prices enough to curb the frivolous use by the rich and the well-to-do. So the richest 10% of the world's people cause 50% of global emissions. You can't raise the price high enough without causing immense hardship amongst low and middle income people. And there are fairer ways to curb emissions. Well, no revolution was ever won with the cry, "We demand less." It may be true that for a majority in the world that 2,000 watts would be a material step up. But for the majority of Canadians and the majority in rest of North America and Western Europe, it would not be a step up. Part of the answer is to go after the carbon energy production, especially in oil and gas and coal exporting countries like Canada, Canada emits 3 times its global per capita fair share. It's partly from Canadians' profligate use. We use much more carbon per capita than a country like Sweden that is equally cold, is very sparse and underpopulated country as well. But production, not consumption of oil and gas, is Canada's largest and fastest growing emission source. And that is also true from a number of other countries like Norway, Russia, and Saudi Arabia. The Environment Ministry forecasts that Canada will fail to meet its Paris climate promises mainly because, and I quote, "The growth in emissions to 2030 is largely driven by growth in the upstream oil and gas sector, and in particular from the oil sands." And they're right about that. We need to curb carbon energy supply, not just demand. To realize Ottawa's climate goals, Canada must quickly phase out the export of all carbon fuel exports, including those of fracked oil and gas and the tar sands. And the tar sands must cease production by 2030. The politics of that are daunting, as I and a few others who've joined with me are trying to do. Big oil would seem to be a tougher adversary than going up against farmers and ranchers to get their land on the land scarcity issue. But food cultures are very deeply entrenched, getting down to issues like family, tradition, food as a source of showing love, that are very entrenched. Troy is right to focus on land scarcity. The next step is to address the politics of how to reclaim all that land and how to overcome entrenched interests in doing so. That is not a criticism. No single article or individual writer, no matter how far-ranging, and Troy's is very far-ranging, can address all questions. It's going to take a collective international effort that tackles the myriad of local circumstances around the globe to do this. I have 3 questions. 1, if we do the near impossible, overcome huge barriers to acceptance, including drastic reductions in meat eating, and rewild half the Earth, what happens to the atmospheric CO2 level once the reforestation stops expanding? At that point, there would not be net gains in CO2 emissions. The half-world plan is only a half solution. We need to drastically reduce emissions, carbon emissions, to net zero. Okay, another question that I have is, Troy talks about the Little Ice Age and how when 10 parts per million were taken out of the carbon emissions were taken out of the atmosphere by the extermination, die-off of so many people in the Western Hemisphere, that lowered the temperature from 0.5 degree in the Northern Hemisphere. If you compare it, so that was that 10 parts per million, compared to 130 that have been gained since the Industrial Revolution. And that has doubled the temperature of that. So it's about 1 to 1.2 degrees around the world. Still, the scale seems to me to be way off. I don't understand how 10 parts per million, I'm not a natural scientist, and I'll have to go back and read the source, but I don't understand. The scale seems to be off in terms of that, being able to do it. The final question Troy argues that in the new eco-austere future, that there's going to be less work overall. But he also says that there's going to be, agriculture is going to be more labor intensive, and that we're going to be replacing blue-collar jobs with pink-collar jobs, caring jobs. So I don't, if there's, how can there be less work overall if the agriculture is more labor intensive and we're going to be getting more into caring kinds of jobs? In concluding, the problem with covering so much ground is that you have to defend yourself on so many fronts. Some people will dismiss Troy's whole argument because they vehemently disagree with a tangential part of it. I sent Troy's article to a friend who didn't like his take on thorium, which Troy devoted a paragraph or less in the article to. So my friend largely dismissed Troy's article. Well, that's nuts. Let's avoid tangents and remember the main argument. Okay, those are my remarks.
Okay, so hi everyone. When Greg first emailed to ask if I could do this, he told me I would get 5 minutes. So then I put together a presentation for 5 minutes. And then I guess a few days ago, Tanner sent an email that I missed seeing. But then he sent another email today in which he said 8 to 10 minutes. So anyway, it's still I added a few more comments, but it'll be relatively short. So let me just begin by saying I think Troy's paper is really fantastic, and it deserves to be widely read and debated. And for my part, there are many things in the paper that I'd be interested in discussing, but since I have a short amount of time, I'll really just make 2 substantive points. First, I want to emphasize that Troy's proposal should not be taken up as a single issue that can be implemented on its own. And I'm sure Troy would agree with me on this. And I think a careful reading of his paper would lead anyone to note that his suggestion that half the planet should be given back to nature, that this proposal must be part of a broader socialist effort. I think part of the failure of the environmental movement, and I think we would all admit that the environmental movement has seen quite a lot of failure. I think part of this failure has had to do with the insistence on putting the environment on a pedestal, on seeing it as separate and above other political concerns. And the approach that results from this is that you take a single proposal, say, the proposal that Troy has, or a carbon tax proposal, or anything else, and that becomes the sole rallying point. But I think while environmental concerns certainly have to be central to our political outlook, they can't be seen as existing above or outside everything else that we're concerned about. In other words, we can't simply suggest that a proposal like Troy's be enacted independently of all the other issues that regular working people have to face on a routine basis. So moving on to my second point, which is sort of related, but and this is a little bit of a tangent. I know what Gordon was saying, shouldn't go off on tangents, but this, I think this one perhaps is I think interesting to sort of think about. So in his paper, Troy critiques Herman Daly's proposals, as everyone knows, his steady state economics. He says, and Troy says that that Daly's being too modestly reformist, which is something I agree with. And then he goes on to say that Daly's proposals are therefore, because they are too modestly reformist, are therefore at risk of being captured by neoliberal environmentalism. I want to suggest that while it's true that Daly's proposals, as well as a lot of other proposals that are a part of the discussion on the environmentalist left, that they certainly are at risk of being co-opted by for neoliberal ends, it's not necessarily because they're too modest. I think actually it would be very possible to propose a radical version of steady state economics, and it would still be quite open to being captured by neoliberal environmentalism. The same could be said about Troy's proposal, which is very radical and necessarily so. I would say that it's also at risk of being captured by neoliberalism. This is because, once again, the risk is not mainly the result of the proposal being modest. Rather, it has to do with the balance of forces that are mobilized around any given proposal at any given time. And the risk is not just that a certain proposal will be captured by neoliberalism. I mean, it could be worse, right? So it can be captured by non-liberalism. So I was actually talking to a friend earlier today about Troy's paper and explaining to him about giving up half the earth back to nature, and his and this very radical reforestation. And his question to me, his immediate question was, well, how do we do that? By killing people? And well, actually, yeah. I mean, that is one way to do it. Conservation actually is something that you could get a lot of authoritarians behind. But that's a separate issue. Let's leave fascist solutions aside for a second. Let's just look at neoliberal ones. So a proposal like Troy's to give up large sections of the earth back to nature. So this proposal could actually end up being implemented, or the attempt to have it be implemented in a way that's centered around, let's say, something like carbon offsets. Those were a major part of the Kyoto Agreement back when things used to be really good. Now we don't really have agreements. I don't know what we're doing. So under Kyoto, countries could pollute as much as they wanted, basically, and then just pay to offset their emissions somewhere else. Often this would be done by providing money for tree planting operations in the third world. And a number of European countries tried to meet their Kyoto targets by carbon offsetting. Canada, of course, just said fuck it and decided to leave the agreement altogether, which was a shame. But even the countries that stayed in the agreement and paid to continue to pollute weren't doing anyone a favor. And I think we, as the left, won't be doing anyone any favors if we can't take radical proposals like Troy's and create shifts in the balance of forces to have these proposals be properly implemented, and to ensure that they aren't co-opted by neoliberal environmentalism or worse. Unfortunately, I don't really have any idea about how to go about shifting the balance of forces as they currently are. Hopefully Troy or Gord or someone else here will have some answers to that question. Thank you very much.